and welcome to the penultimate episode of our Tech Space podcast looking at the future of work. And I am joined today by Steve from Unmind. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Jane.
Do you want to, first of all, just tell me a little bit about Unmind?
Yeah, sure. We are a workplace mental health and wellbeing platform. So we help employees to better understand and take care of their mental health and wellbeing, but then importantly also help organizations better understand how to create the types of cultures and environments that better support mental health and well-being, and then make the link between that and business performance.
And you've got quite an interesting backstory. So tell me a bit about that. You started off in a very different profession.
Sure. Yeah, so I was in the entertainment industry. I was a singer and an actor and a theatre performer, bit of modeling for my sins as well. So I was in that space for a while. For about just under a decade. And I loved aspects of it, but it also brought with it, I guess, some less than healthy lifestyle choices. And so because of that, I think I struggled as well, mentally, emotionally.
And so you kind of decided that you wanted to found a company. Was it that you wanted to found a company or that you wanted to do something in the mental health space?
Yeah, I mean, that came later. I'll give you a brief insight into how that transpired, but I was in the Indian industry. Like I say, it was probably playing a large role in my depression and insomnia, which I had for almost a decade. I reached a point where I was nearing rock bottom. That coincided with the 2007-2008 recession. So the entertainment industry was hit hard. And so I was almost forced to reflect, assess my life, decided to take a role as a singer on a cruise liner for like almost 2 years just to get away from things. There was a lot of introspection and reflection during that time. I became really interested in philosophy and spirituality and well-being and human potential. And I decided that I wanted to do something different with my life. And so I had this vision of like one day, so my well-being had transformed while I was applying these things in my life. And I had a vision of one day helping people to do the same thing. Wasn't quite sure how I'd go about that. But when I got back on land, I decided to start with sort of the easiest entry point, which is the body. I became a personal trainer, and then over the next 10 years did lots of learning and expanding my capacity to help people, and ultimately that led to Unmind.
Now, you mentioned there, that global events sometimes play a role, like the crash of 2008. There was no global event quite like the pandemic that affected us all. What do you think the impact of that has been on people's mental health generally in the workplace?
I think it's had a massive impact. I mean, we don't exist in vacuums or isolation, right? Our mental health is impacted, yes, by our own thoughts and behaviors, but also very much by our relationships and, crucially, like the environments that we're in, the cultures that we're in. So that speaks both to organizational cultures, but also like macroeconomic, socio-political environments that we find ourselves in. And so all of a sudden finding ourselves in the pandemic and in lockdown and not having our usual social interaction and living in a very uncertain, unstable, volatile world, like that had a very real impact on our mental health. I think it's still having an impact on our mental health.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that, but just paint me a picture of Unmind's journey, because you were founded in 2016, pre-pandemic. Then you had to cope with the pandemic, and now we're obviously in this sort of slightly uncertain post-pandemic world. So what was the impact of that, those three different kind of types of working on your business specifically? Yeah,
it's been interesting. It's had a very real impact, and I can look at the Unmind journey in those three parts, as it were, pre, during, and post-pandemic. Pre, we were, a young company, just evolving organically, hiring people that had a very real passion for the space that we were in, wanting to make a difference. We had a great little culture pre-pandemic, so we were about 30 employees by when the pandemic hit. Then the pandemic hit, and we went on, as did everyone else, all of a sudden to working from home. Ways of working that might have suited us then were starting to sort of fray at the edges, as it were. We went from 30 to like close to 200 employees during the pandemic. We went from, let's say, a vitamin to a painkiller overnight for organizations. And so people were lining up to become our clients, etc. So we also then gave Unmind to all NHS employees during that time, which brought an extra like 2 million people onto our platform. So to say that during the pandemic was an intense period would be understating it. So we had that, experienced some challenges because of that, cultural challenges. What sort of worked before didn't necessarily work for us anymore. And so then post-pandemic, we've been going through a cultural evolution to better meet the market that we're in now, this post-pandemic world, which was rocky and bumpy, but now we're sort of finding ourselves in that. So it's been really interesting.
And you've got office space in London. You've also got an office in New York and Australia.
Yeah.
So what does the working week look like in those different offices? And is the culture different in America and Australia compared to here?
Yeah, I would say that there's some nuanced differences between the three different cultures that's born out of just the cultural differences between those countries. But ultimately, like we've got such a strong intentional culture at Unmind that there's a common thread between all three. And that is that, we care about what we're doing, we prioritize mental health and well-being, and we make that link between that and business performance, and that's consistent across all three. We obviously, with time zone difference, it's difficult to stay properly connected, but we ensure that we do to whatever degree we can. Some of the leaders will obviously go and visit the offices in New York and Sydney just to ensure that we're getting FaceTime with employees. Occasionally, we'll have like an all-company get together. Obviously, not that often, but we'll ensure that we get that kind of time to bond and connect. So yeah, I think we've just approached it that way, and we've managed to ensure that there's some strong sense of cohesion still, despite the time zone difference.
Now, you mentioned the NHS was a customer of yours. The pandemic for NHS workers was horrific. I can see the need there for mental health. But actually, it feels as if a lot of companies have embraced and in a new way this understanding that this has to be offered, that so they have to have a policy around, well-being. So what does a good policy around well-being look like from your perspective?
So a good strategy approach to well-being, it shouldn't just be like a tick box exercise. So during the pandemic, I think, and there were organizations pre-pandemic that were prioritizing mental health and well-being for sure. We had clients. But during the pandemic, like I mentioned earlier, companies started scrambling to find out ways to support their employees. And so there was a proliferation of mental health apps. I think 95% aren't validated by science, so they sort of flooded the market, might not have been that effective. So I think many organizations jumped onto that, which is insufficient, right? And so it can be useful in terms of psychoeducation and supporting employees, but unless you are not just looking at it through the lens of problems, in other words, if you're not just taking a reactive approach, which is only serving 1 out of 5 employees, you need to take a proactive approach that recognizes that we all have mental health all of the time, and we need to know how to take care of our mental health and well-being. So apps can serve and platforms can serve a purpose there. But that's insufficient if you're not then looking at the rest of the organization. It can't just be down to the individual. You can give them all the support you want and EAP services, etc. But if they're still within a toxic environment and culture, that's not going to cut it. And so organizations, to really create a healthy workforce, need to take a whole organization approach. And that means leadership needs to be brought in, management needs to be trained and empowered to know how to support their people and create healthy team cultures, well-being champions. So in other words, and then crucially, it needs to be integrated into the business. It has to be seen as a strategic driver of business performance. When you have all of that in place, and I think you've got an effective, impactful well-being strategy.
Because productivity and well-being seem obviously to be linked, right? If you've got a happy workforce and they're motivated, then you're going to get better results. Is there much data out there to back that claim up? Are companies that have sort of introduced things like Unmind or maybe gone down a different path, are they seeing those results after having, really thought about their well-being strategies?
Yeah, so first of all, we're able to show our clients the impact of improving mental health and well-being and improving their culture on the bottom line. So that obviously helps to get their buy-in. But more broadly, like there's a lot of research and evidence now to support the connection that you just made between well-being and performance. For example, we know that, in terms of large organizations, the top most healthy organizations, those with the highest levels of employee well-being, they outperform the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones by like 20% since 2021. So there's real data. But I would say that still, based on actions, many leaders and organizations don't see that link. And they're still putting productivity above people. And I think it's almost an hangover from the Industrial Revolution of sorts. And I think to the degree that you do that, prioritize productivity above people, we're going to carry on getting the challenges that we're faced with today. We know that half the UK workforce is close to burnout. We know that about 75% of them have report being in a toxic workplace, not trusting their leaders, and like a staggering 9 out of 10 will say that they're not engaged at work. And I think that's a result of putting productivity above people. So what we need to do, like you suggested in the beginning, is recognize that these are intrinsically linked, and it's not an either-or thing, it's a both-and approach to really get a high-performing organization, especially a sustainably high-performing organization. We need to, yes, of course, prioritize results, but alongside prioritizing mental health and well-being. And the way that you make that a synergy is by recognizing that we're dealing with human beings here, not cogs in a machine. Human beings have human needs. And if we understand that and start to create workplace cultures that meet those human needs, then we increase creativity, capacity to collaborate well, to problem solve, to effectively become more productive in a more sustainable way. So that's how I think we should be thinking about this.
And is it easier for I know some of your clients are big corporates. Is it easier for a big corporation to integrate that? I mean, obviously they'll have policies that they have to change, and it might be harder to get new things in, but they've also got more resources. They might have an HR department that can take over this work if they want to introduce a completely different well-being policy. And then you've got startups who might struggle to do that because they don't have as much money, and they sort of almost do have a culture of, we've got to work really hard because we've got to get this business started. So how do you see that working out in terms of well-being, the difference between the startup culture and the corporate culture?
Yeah, it's interesting. In some ways, you might think that it might be easier for large organizations who have the budget and they have the HR departments and the like. You might also argue that they might be stuck in outdated traditional ways of looking at this, so it might be holding them back, whereas startups won't be, and they have the capacity to be more agile and experimental and take a more constructive approach to mental health and well-being. And I can, use ourselves, Unmind, as an example, right? We're a startup. We've gone through the very same challenges around being a venture capital backed, startup, highly demanding environment, market pressures. We've had all of that, and we've committed to still prioritize mental health and well-being. So much so that one of our key performance indicators for our company it's a question that I ask our employees every month, and it's, what impact is working at Unmind having on your mental health and well-being? And it's like a Likert scale from very negative to very positive impact. And my goal is by 2026 for it to be that 100% of Unminders experience a net positive impact on their mental health and well-being by working at Unmind. Right now we're at about 75%, which is way above standard, right? And it should be that, because work has all the conditions to meet our needs for well-being. Things like belonging and connection and self-esteem and mastery and all the rest, right? But we need to intentionally design our workplaces in a way that meet those needs. And we can't do that without leadership buy-in. So myself and my co-founder, he's a clinical psychologist. I came from a workplace wellbeing consultancy background. So obviously we understood that this was important. So I guess we had a bit of an advantage then from the start, and that we organically prioritize this from the very beginning. But the invitation would be, based on some of the science I've already shared, is to really, if you're a startup, to lean into this, even though it might feel difficult, because ultimately it'll pay off.
It's interesting that you mentioned surveys there. I remember we had these surveys when I worked at the BBC, and actually for a lot of people, they were just an excuse to moan. And it's the same as when you look at reviews. You tend to see more negative ones. People kind of naturally feel that they want to sort of be more negative.
Yeah.
So do you think those surveys have a worthwhile place to play in organisations, or do you think they could be skewed because people are just going to use them as an excuse to moan?
Sure. It's a good question. I think they are only as useful as the degree to which you actually act on them and communicate your insights to the company. So make it a conversation and show that there's some meaning behind this. I don't think people struggle from or suffer from survey fatigue. It's like lack of action fatigue. And so, we'll like share the reports with our employees. Obviously, we're not going to change things like there and then. We can't be too reactive because, like you say, people have a negativity bias and they're probably prone to like point out what's wrong. But we use that to inform our well-being strategy, and we keep it an ongoing, transparent dialogue. So I think that's the important bit. You actually need to actually use the data.
And one of the things that the pandemic did, we've already mentioned that, it kind of really raised mental health to being a very high profile and, talked about thing. It also affected people's mental health in different ways. Some people absolutely loved working from home and couldn't imagine going back into an office, didn't want to go back into an office. For other people, being stuck at home really affected their mental health and they wanted to get back to that. How did companies negotiate that we're all now aware that our mental health is linked to how we work, and B, that people are going to want different things depending on their personalities?
Yeah, it's so important, and it's a challenge, right? That we've experienced, that I guess probably all companies are experiencing. I don't think the solution is to mandate anything, right? So I think flexibility is something that organizations should lean into. However, I recognize that might look different from organization to organization and industry to industry, and that we have different constraints across organizations and across industries. But we know that human beings, or let's say adults, like to be treated like adults, right? Which means having a sense of agency, some sense of autonomy, some sense of self-direction. And so we know, like you said, that employees that have access to flexible working policies, they have better mental health and well-being. But not only that, they're more engaged, they have more discretionary effort for their organization, they're more committed. And that's because they're being treated like adults, right? And it's because they feel trusted. So that's super important. However, it's not just a give thing, it's a give and take thing, right? So you need flexibility offered from the organization, but you need responsibility offered by the employees as well. But now that's only going to happen in a culture of trust. If you trust your leaders when you know or you believe that they care about your mental health and well-being. In fact, there's something called, well, I won't go into the science, but the degree to which leaders care or are perceived as caring about employees' mental health and well-being is known as the cause of causes of things like psychological well-being in the workplace, but also engagement and the like. So it's really important. So that's why I think just mandating something is not going to work. And even though it's a give and take, I would say probably cultivating trust rests initially with the employer first. You need to show that you care, right? And then I think employees will trust you, and then they will, I guess, offer their side of this equation by taking responsibility for outcomes.
Now, we've talked about lots of the positives of having these policies. What are some of the obstacles that you see in people's way preventing them from doing this?
So in terms of flexibility?
Yeah, in terms of implementing these kind of policies company-wide.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges are that there's no one size fits all, that people want different things. Sometimes that it's like, this is how we've done things in the past and this is how we want to do things in the future. So like maybe a bit of a discomfort around taking the foot off that control pedal and giving people more autonomy, more flexibility. So there could be some fear around that. And that we don't, this is still a liminal experimental phase that we're in. We don't know for sure what the exact playbook is, right? So it requires, I guess, some comfort with the unknown. But for me, it requires us recognizing that we're dealing with human beings here and with adults who need autonomy and agency and to be respected and trusted. So I think when we can get that right, then we can like work together, employees and employer, to try and figure this out in a way that works for each organization.
Now, one of the things that the text-based survey found is that people are, coming back to the office. They're perhaps now coming back on Mondays as well as Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. It's sort of evening out that people want to spend a reasonable amount of their working week in an office with other people. So what can we do in terms of physical office space to make that the best place for our employees? I came across a company that had a room full of VR headsets, and people could just go in there and relax and go off to these kind of wonderful VR virtual reality worlds and spend some time just relaxing there. I mean, that seemed like quite a good idea, although probably quite expensive because these headsets aren't cheap. Have you got any other sort of examples where people have used their actual physical workspace to make it a better environment?
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, again, you can man it if you want, but you want people to want to come into the office. It needs to be an environment that is inspiring, that facilitates connection and collaboration. So I think that's really important. So, at our company, the only thing we don't mandate, but the only thing we ask for is that we have team days once a week where different teams will come into the office, and the rest of the time it's up to them. But we have some employees who come in 5 days a week. We have some who just come in that 1 day a week. It depends on family circumstances. It depends on many things, right? But in terms of how we are making our workspace an inviting and constructive space, is we are ensuring that there is a collaboration space. So that we actually sort of re-optimize our office so that people could come in and there's couches and there's collaboration. It's conducive to collaboration, right? So we made sure that was in place, but also we've got like focus areas of people who need, distraction-free zones. We've ensured that that's in place. We made sure that our office is beautiful and feels inspiring and has lots of like light coming in. So I mean, it'll look different from organization to organization, but it needs to feel like it needs to be a place where people want to come to.
Light's an important thing, isn't it?
For us,
so many offices don't have that and perhaps can't kind of bring that in retrospectively.
Sure.
But there's other things they can do, I guess, like fill their offices with plants. I mean, do people kind of comment on this when they're talking about, what it makes them feel happy at work? Is it about the actual physical space, or is it more about the sort of culture and feeling that they're part of a team? What's the thing that's most important to employees, do you think?
Look, I do think the physical space plays a role for sure. Like, an inspiring, inviting space is going to have an impact on our state of mind, right? And like you mentioned, plants. You could there's even research to show that wallpaper plants, like nature wallpaper.
We're looking at a forest.
There we are. Has an impact on our state of mind as well. So that's really important. But I think what's supremely important is the culture, the climate, the way that people relate to one another. Like, do you feel seen as an actual human being, and are my needs honored and respected? And it's that kind of thing that I think is particularly important. And I would say, unfortunately, that there's a tendency for us to forget that in the workplace because there's such a focus on tasks and results, understandably so. But if we do that at the expense of recognizing our common humanity, we're going to create a culture that you can describe as toxic because it becomes damaging on people's mental health and well-being. So I think that's the most important bit.
Now, one of the things that happened to me during lockdown is that the demarcation between work and non-work was blurred because my office was my home and my emails were on my phone, and that became not a problem, but it was different. It was a different way of working. Burnout and not knowing when to sort of stop, that's an important part, I guess, of any well-being policy. Again, is that something that needs to be mandated, or does that vary from person to person? How do you deal with that issue of people just basically working too hard?
Yeah, I think it comes down to organizational responsibility, manager responsibility, and employee responsibility. We need to take also responsibility for ourselves, right? And this could be an education thing, but I think all of those, like, you don't want to create a culture where working all hours into the night is like prized and like that's what gives you the gold star, right? And managers need to respect people's personal boundaries. That being said, those personal boundaries might look different from person to person, right? And so you need to, establish relationships with your team and understand what their needs are, and then make it safe for employees to feel like they can speak their truth and let their managers know what their personal boundaries are and how they like to work. So again, it just comes down to this, respecting each other's common humanity, creating a psychologically safe environment where people are able to share their truth and show up as they are and work in ways that work for them, and then creating the culture that facilitates all of that.
Now, you've used the word human quite a lot in this interview, and actually there's a worry in the back of people's minds. It might not be particularly well formed at the moment, but there's a lot of headlines about AI and how it's coming to take all of our jobs. How do we deal with that kind of concern? And what are your sort of general thoughts about the role that AI is going to play in the future of work?
Yeah. I mean, I'm no AI expert. I did listen to Scott Galloway's talk, one of his talks last night, and he's probably more informed than I am on this, but he says we don't need to worry about AI taking our jobs anytime soon. However, people who don't know how to effectively use AI at work might have a problem, right? So we need to learn how to leverage AI to sort of augment our human capacities at work. So I think that bit's important. I would hate it if AI reduced the amount of humanity in our workplaces. So ideally we want, I don't think there's a world where there's low tech. I think high tech is going to happen, but also needs to be high life tech that is in service of life, humanity, and well-being. And I think there's an opportunity for that to be the case. Even in mental health and well-being, I think AI has a very real role to play in supporting employee well-being in workplaces if it is done in a responsible way, and if the right people are training and creating those sort of AI coaches and all the like. So there's potential for it to be positive, but it has to be done in the right way.
So we've recently seen the government introduce its flexible working legislation. Do you think there's space now for government legislation on wellbeing policies at work as well?
Sure. It's really interesting. I guess in an ideal world, I would say no, we shouldn't have to rely on legislation to make organizations prioritize and look after employee mental health and well-being. But I think realistically, perhaps that is what is needed. I had a chat with a lawyer not so long ago during an event who told me that within the legal industry, it's going to take something like legislation to make them reconsider how they go about their work. In other words, it'll take only risk to change their behaviors. So I thought that was interesting. There are already countries that are doing this. So Australia, for example, they're often quite progressive when it comes to workplace mental health and well-being, and I guess they're leading the way. They have legislation. It's Work Health and Safety Act, where it is now a legal obligation for organizations to create mentally healthy workplace cultures and protect workplace mental health and well-being, or employee mental health and well-being. So that's really interesting. There are then also other clues in terms of that we might be heading in this direction. So something like there's an ISO standard 45003, I think it is. It's not legal, but it's a strong guideline for organizations around the world to reduce psychosocial hazards in the workplace. So that's something that is there. That was followed up by World Health Organization sharing their guidelines and stating that workplace mental health is not an HR concern, it's a human right. So I think that's really important. And that was followed up by the US Surgeon General, his guidelines for healthy workplaces. And I think he stated that work needs to be good for well-being. So I think these are all signs that perhaps we head in that direction. And I think for organizations, perhaps risk mitigation in the face of potential legal consequences might be what really shifts mindsets and behaviors.
Be interesting to see how that develops. Now, we've talked about some of the trends that you've seen. So people kind of just putting apps on, buying into apps, well-being apps. I've mentioned the VR headsets. What are the trends that you see in the future of kind of well-being being integrated into the workforce? Is there other things out there that you see becoming standard?
Yeah. We actually did a trends report recently, and I think it was around about 87% of HR leaders saw AI being an integral part of their well-being strategy over the next few years by 2030. So I think that is going to play a role. And I think if done properly, it can help to really personalize, like deeply personalize mental health and wellbeing support in the workplace. So I think that could play a role. And I can see it really empowering managers as well, because managers are being asked to support the mental health and wellbeing of their people today. They're often under-equipped to know how to do so. And so I think AI could play a role there in like meeting them in their flow of work and guiding them around how to address specific situations and create psychologically healthy teams, right? So there's that piece I think is important. I think the younger generation's expectations are going to play a role in what shifts over the coming years, especially Generation Alpha. I think they're the kids of millennials, let's say. Their expectations around things like, I mean, am I right there?
We've gone from Z back to A, have we?
I think it's Alpha, yeah. I think their expectations around things like inclusivity and flexibility and mental health and well-being being like an integral part of an organization's fabric, I think those are going to force organizations to adapt, because I see the young generation only wanting to work for organizations where it doesn't negatively impact their mental health and well-being. So I think that could really play an important role moving forward. The final thing I'd say is, and we spoke about this earlier, I think there's going to be, and I already see it happening, a shift from just focusing on productivity to realizing that there's an integral link between performance and well-being, and there being more of a shift towards sustainable high performance, which is, I guess, the marrying of the two.
That sounds like the perfect scenario for a future workplace. But what about now? People that have mental health issues now who maybe don't know what to do about it. What would your advice be to them in a work environment? In a work environment?
Well, I mean, first of all, you should be able to reach out to someone at work, typically within your HR team. I do know, however, that in some organizations that there's still stigma and fear that being open about your mental health or lack thereof might lead to negative consequences, which is, I mean, from my perspective, terrible. And my gut reaction to that is, if that is the case, if you think your mental health status is going to be held against you in your organization, like, you know, that's a good reason to perhaps leave that organization. However, we don't live in an ideal world, and that may not be an option. So I would say, first of all, just make sure that you've got a support system in place. And that can come from yourself to a degree with like self-care strategies and self-compassion, but reach out and talk to perhaps a trusted colleague, friends, loved ones, like be open about your mental health. It can be difficult, but really knowing there's someone there to listen to you and be there for you is really important. So there's that. A lot of organizations have mental health resources, and even if it's just an EAP, for example, so use those resources to get confidential professional support. If your company doesn't have one, then we've got, there's mental health charities and phone lines like Shout and Samaritans, etc., that you could reach out to. And then I would say, if you're still concerned about how your organization is approaching it, familiarize yourself with your policies and your sort of legal rights around mental health and well-being, and prepare yourself to have a conversation with probably your HR team around your mental health and around your needs and perhaps accommodations that you might have.
So the advice there is basically don't keep things to yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve, for a really fascinating chat.
That's a pleasure, Jane.